Thank you, Barbara, for that gracious introduction. And thank you, all of you, for coming together in such beautiful surroundings in this town that Sam Clemens loved so much. And on this evening that marks Clemens' 177th birthday. For giving of your time and your attention while we consider over the next 35 or 40 minutes two enduring icons of our nation's past. The easiest way for me to discuss Mark Twain and America's, quote, worst, close quote, president is by reference to my recent book, Mark Twain and the Colonel, Samuel L. Clemens, Theodore Roosevelt, and the Arrival of a New Century. Let me begin then by reading the opening words of that book's preface, the first 6 sentences that readers come upon. One dominated the culture of his era, the other its politics. Two towering Americans alive at the beginning of the 20th century who, more than 100 years later, are still vital, still known worldwide. Mark Twain and Theodore Roosevelt were often in New York City at that period of their lives, and because both were gregarious, their paths were bound to cross. Each was a prolific writer, and on a wide variety of subjects. In addition, each filled other professional roles besides authorship. Mark Twain, principally as a lecturer, Roosevelt as a politician. They had first met in the mid-1880s. In their many appearances before the public thereafter, neither was heard to speak ill of the other. But in private, they unburdened their minds more candidly. Right here at the start, I should make clear that Mark Twain thought the politician Roosevelt, and I quote, was far and away the worst president we have ever had. In fact, my stumbling upon that blunt opinion of Mark Twain's in Mark Twain in Eruption, a collection of his posthumous writings, was what led me to devote 4 or 5 years to researching and writing Mark Twain and the Colonel. And I might remark in passing on what a rewarding 4 or 5 years they turned out to be. I'm so much smarter now. When I hear the evening news, I hear it differently from before. So many of the unresolved issues that plague us at present were alive, well, and in full cry back then. The Civil War and transcontinental railroads had replaced an agrarian union of sovereign states with an industrialized corporate nation. So that even then, those 100 and more years ago, new issues had surfaced, such as whether the federal government had grown too big. Could the president go around Congress by issuing an executive order, as President Roosevelt did in 1903 to create Pelican Island as a wildlife sanctuary, to save from extinction this snowy egret, slain for plumes to adorn ladies' hats across the land? Did Roosevelt have any right to set aside millions of acres of mineral-rich mountain and timberlands, our acres, as national parks and forests for future generations? Mining and lumber interests screamed, no, get government out of the way. And were corporations people? Supreme Court appeared to be saying so as early as 1886. Some of those same corporations had grown into trusts, huge conglomerations of wealth, Rockefeller's Oil Trust, Carnegie Steel Trust, Armour's Beef Trust, so that disparities in wealth were widening on a scale never seen before. A few very, very rich people and vastly increasing numbers of poor, with immigrants flooding in who didn't look like earlier Americans. All those Italians, Slavs, Jews, and Japanese. Or this, for one last specific example, from a speech in 1896 that would become famous. The Democrat William Jennings Bryan, building up to his climactic image of a cross of gold. There are those, he's referring to Republicans, who believe that if you will only legislate to make the well-to-do prosperous, their prosperity will leak through on those below. The Democratic idea, however, has been that if you legislate to make the masses prosperous, their prosperity will find its way up through every class which rests upon them. 1896. Change leaked through to trickle down, and it's as current as last night's news. But to return, why did Clemens feel as he did about Roosevelt, the politician? Nor was his talk about the worst president merely a passing bit of Twainian hyperbole. Here's the same idea rephrased more obliquely, if no less unambiguously, on a different occasion. It would grieve me deeply, Clemens wrote, to be obliged to believe that any very large number of sane and thinking and intelligent Republicans privately admire Mr. Roosevelt and do not despise him. What made America's favorite humorist feel like that? Colonel Roosevelt, and he dearly loved the title, which he had earned in the Spanish-American War, had ascended to the White House as our 26th president when he was 42 years old, the youngest chief executive that the nation has ever had before or since. Yet despite his youth, Roosevelt was maybe the best prepared ever to occupy the office. Before taking on his presidential responsibilities that fall of 1901, he had served in city government as New York's dedicated police commissioner, in state government as a member of the New York Assembly and governor of New York, and in federal government as civil service commissioner, very active assistant secretary of the Navy, and vice president of the United States. Upon the assassination of his predecessor, William McKinley, Roosevelt was propelled in September 1901 into the White House, a name long in use, but that he promptly made official, banishing the pompous term executive mansion from White House stationery. The young politician's achievements during his 7.5 years between the fall of 1901 and March 1909 in the highest office in the land were many. He mediated an end to the Russo-Japanese War, the bloodiest conflict in world history up to that time, and for his efforts was awarded the Nobel Prize, the first American to be so honored. He made possible the building of the Panama Canal. He took on the trusts, those huge amassments of capital that had come together late in the 19th century as something entirely new in American economic life. He took them on and helped fashion the tools that curbed their burgeoning excesses. He signed the Pure Food and Drug Act, as well as acts that prohibited the errant favoritism railroads had long indulged in setting their shipping rates and ticket pricing. He sent the American Navy support vessels in 16 great battleships that he had been largely responsible for getting built on a 14-month cruise around the world, a goodwill mission of the so-called Great White Fleet that awakened jubilant enthusiasm wherever it went, and that he regarded as his greatest contribution to world peace. He articulated the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, that European nations would no longer be allowed to intervene to collect their debts from countries of the Western Hemisphere. We would do that for them, and Europe must stay out. He instituted a program of conservation of America's natural resources for the benefit of posterity, and against the protests and outcries of the many who thought that the land belonged to them, to the particular generation alive at that time to exploit as private enterprise saw fit. And he led America onto the world stage, making the nation for the first time an international power, which since then it has never ceased to be. All that leadership made Roosevelt very popular with the people, their Rough Rider hero, their Teddy, a nickname incidentally that Theodore roundly disliked, and one that his friends never called him, or if they did, only behind his back and in good-humored irony. But whatever the few may have found to cavil about, the people at large loved their Teddy, elected him to his own term as president in 1904 with a vote count larger, by far, than any candidate to the office had ever had. And even now, when a substantial number of professional historians are called together every decade or two to rate the American presidents, Theodore Roosevelt invariably comes out in the top 5. Up there with Washington, Lincoln, Jefferson, and T.R.'s cousin Franklin Roosevelt. And it is the 60-foot-high, bespectacled face of Theodore Roosevelt that gazes out, by no means inappropriately when you think about it, from Mount Rushmore, amid 3 other giants in our presidential pantheon. So why did Mark Twain feel toward Roosevelt as he did? It wasn't personal. Mr. Roosevelt is one of the most likable men that I am acquainted with. Clemens, who was acquainted with just about everybody, for who wouldn't want to be friends with Mark Twain, wrote in 1906. Face to face, the man Roosevelt was irresistible. An electric charge running up Clemens's arm every time he shook the colonel's hand. And Mrs. Roosevelt was in every way winning, charming, Clemens calls her, simple, and without any shred of self-consciousness, a lovely woman. So his feelings weren't personal. But Mark Twain didn't care much for politicians anyway. Hadn't ever since reporting on their legislative doings way back in the 1860s in Nevada Territory. And anyhow, he and Roosevelt, despite many similarities, were different in fundamental ways. Roosevelt, buoyant and ever active, Clemens, more mercurial, and more the passive observer. Clemens, who came from a slave-holding border state in the center of America, grew up poor and self-taught. Roosevelt was born into wealth in a great northern followed by a Harvard education and very early access to politics. Yet both men became enormous successes in their time, and both were widely adored. Indeed, Mark Twain may be the most popular American who has ever lived. I can't think of any other American who is more popular than Mark Twain, even though he insisted in a tone that sounds disgruntled that the Colonel was the most popular man in America during their overlapping lifetimes, and no doubt for all the wrong, bellicose reasons. Finally, Mark Twain at his best in Huckleberry Finn and large portions of Life on the Mississippi was of the agrarian past. Roosevelt looked determinedly forward into America's global future. They were bound to differ then, as in crucial ways they resembled each other. That comparison and contrast is dealt with in this rather more extended passage from Mark Twain and the Colonel. Some of Clemens's irritation with his younger contemporary may have arisen from their similarities. Both, after all, were on the public stage and liked it there. Both were internationally famous, citizens of the world. Both were small d Democrats at heart, friends alike of the exalted and the humble. And both were restless and impulsive, omnivorous in their curiosity, raconteurs who were listened to rapidly, both given to hyperbole, able to go shrill with colorful invective. Both, moreover, were uxorious, and both stayed young in spirit almost to the end. Come to that, maybe such lifelong youthfulness is a trait of the genius that Clemens and Roosevelt shared, seeing every day freshly through a child's eyes, differently from how the habituated multitudes read their future, each day making them a little bit older, tireder, and more conventional. Yet for all their similarities, these two public figures differed from one another, and not only in age. Clemens, the senior, by nearly a quarter century, although age was crucial to what separated. For the elderly Mark Twain, young Mr. Roosevelt appeared hardly mature enough to be presidential. But then, this 20th wasn't the humorous century anyhow, even as he wished it well. His was the 19th, and his heart lingered in the agrarian America of that earlier time. Or so it would appear from the best of his writing, though the man was protean, even more so than Roosevelt. Sam Clemens was out of agrarian America, yet he exulted in the urban East's technologies of typewriters, telephones, water closets, electric lights, bicycles, and miraculous typesetters. Satirist of the greed-soaked Gilded Age, the title of one of his novels, he nevertheless was an avid speculator himself, who relished his friendships with the captains of American industry and grumbled when President Roosevelt hectored him. He was a man of the people, who built 2 mansions and enjoyed at least third overlooking the Hudson. An idealist who insisted on the material comforts of first-class travel even as his wife strived to economize. He was the imaginative, free-thinking iconoclast who urged on his daughters the most conventional husband and father who spent weeks in travel, away from home, and didn't always get along with his children once they were grown. The humorist, vexed when reviewers refused to take him seriously. The entirely original author out of the frontier West, who coveted the approval of the modish, genteel East. The artist of some of America's supreme literature, who kept one eye ever fixed on ways to maximize sales and profits. And he could bear a grudge and be unforgiving toward Bret Harte, toward Whitlaw Reid, toward Charlie Webster, toward James M. Page, and finally toward Theodore Roosevelt. Not as a person, but as a politician. The bumptious politician Roosevelt, at the helm of our ship of state, who had steered America off its steady course, pointing toward democracy, in order to follow Europe's lead on the way to empire. Then there were the families. By this late period in his life, the elderly Mark Twain had lost a beloved daughter, Susie, at age 24 in 1896. And the grief of that loss still hung over him, and he was convinced, was even then hastening his adored wife, Livy's death. She died in 1904, 3 years after the large, healthy, and boisterous Roosevelt family had descended on the White House. Those half-dozen Roosevelt children so much in the public eye, the papers full of their doings, and their sayings, and their pets, and their stilts, and the trays they appropriated from the White House kitchen to ride down the executive staircase on. Above all, there was Alice, Roosevelt's daughter by his first wife, the beautiful young woman whose debut just before she turned 18 had been a social event that the press couldn't stop talking about in early 1902, only months after President Roosevelt had assumed his new duties. Here's yet another passage about Alice from Mark Twain and the Colonel. Alice, in her arresting way, had all at once become famous, the press's darling ever since her debut. From the Lees, her late mother's wealthy family, she enjoyed her own quite generous allowance, which let her do pretty much what she liked. And what she liked made for good copy. She was observed shockingly smoking a cigarette, drove a car unchaperoned from Newport to Boston at the foolhardy speed of 25 miles an hour, carried a pet snake about, played poker, gambled, and danced on the Vanderbilt's roof at midnight. When His Imperial Majesty the Kaiser dispatched his brother to take possession of a royal yacht in the shipyard off Jersey City, Alice was chosen to break the champagne bottle over the prow and christen the vessel the Meteor. The press, as ever enraptured by her fresh and very photogenic face and figure, covered that February christening step by step, noting with approval Miss Roosevelt's composure and grace in the performance of her duty, and commenting on the attention that gallant Prince Heinrich paid America's uncrowned princess. For Princess Alice had become the toast of the land. Alice blue, as in Miss Roosevelt's eyes, was the new fashionable color. Songs were written about her, the Alice Roosevelt March, and somewhat later the vastly popular Alice Blue Gown. While other songs were dedicated to her, promoted as ones she favored. proved conventional enough to be boy crazy, focused on marriage as soon as the right suitor came along. It was what young ladies did when they could, marry someone handsome and rich. The press loved it. Not that Alice as a matron planned on breeding scads of children. A couple of years on, she and 3 girlfriends borrowed a favorite theme of her father's and formed the Race Suicide Club, meeting discreetly to amuse each other with the daring of their maidenly talk. Not at all what Colonel Roosevelt had in mind when he used the term. What Roosevelt meant by race suicide, which he considered literally the greatest danger that America faced, lay in the small number of children that the census revealed Anglo-Saxon families were having, even as Mediterranean and Slavic immigrants flooded America's shores. That was one of the things that Mark Twain held against the New Yorker as politician. The man seemed insane on the matter of race suicide. To Clemens, Roosevelt was pretty much insane about hunting, too. Something that Mark Twain, as he told his friend William Dean Howells, didn't care 2 cents for, hunting or fishing either. How could anybody take pleasure in tracking down a majestic 4-legged creature and firing bullets into it? But most of all, to Clemens' way of thinking, the president sounded like a lunatic when he extolled the manly virtues that warfare brings out. Discipline, self-reliance, resourcefulness, teamwork, pride, a sense of duty. And such extolling of bloodshed led to what looked to Mark Twain's eyes like a new American swagger on the world stage, as Roosevelt led the country to take what the president thought was its proper place as a great nation. We would expand into the Pacific, bring order to the Philippine Islands that we had inherited as an unexpected prize of the Spanish-American War, and make that archipelago essentially part of an American empire. But to Clemens, empire and democracy didn't mix. America had no business replacing Spain's tyranny in the Philippines with troops of our own. For we had been fighting a bloody war over there against Filipinos from 1899 on into the early years of the 20th century that we had better not have got ourselves mixed up in. We should get out and let those we had freed from 300 years of Spanish misrule rule over their own lands, according to their own lights. And this was what Samuel Clemens deplored most about the new course that Roosevelt seemed to be steering us on, toward an imperial America that was betraying its founding values of freedom, of the press, of religion, of assembly, was betraying our nation's unique boast that our citizens were equal before the law, and that our rulers ruled only with the consent of the government. Filipinos had not given their consent, and certainly were not being treated as equals. Nor did a single Filipino pose the slightest threat to our national security. The issue of America's military involvement in foreign lands is part, of course, of what makes the study of the period feel so current, so relevant. How will we ever get out of that quagmire? Clemens asked, using that word, watching as modern America took shape. Sometimes it scarcely felt like Sam Clemens' country any longer. He takes America hard, Howells said of his friend. With a young president who strut and swaggered, the people adored, our first urban president, New York City born, not always presidentially dignified, yet who was no doubt destined for undying fame as leader of this new industrial imperial giant. The 20th century is a stranger to me. The author of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, those indelible impressions of agrarian life, would conclude in old age. I wish it well, but my heart is all with my own century. I took 65 years of it. He who had been born in 1835 remarked of the 19th century, just on a list. But if I had known as much about it as I know now, I would have taken the whole of it. Mark Twain died in 1910. Roosevelt in 1919. The final chapter of Mark Twain and the Colonel, chapter 48 afterward, deals with the subsequent fate of personalities met with in the course of the narrative. It begins this way. Roosevelt had professed an indifference to fame. I am not in the least concerned as to whether I will have any place in history, he said, and indeed I do not remember ever thinking about it. It was enough to lead a full, decent life and be of some use. Of course he would want his family to be proud of him and his friends to remember him and respect the way he lived. But aside from this, it does not seem to me that after a man is dead, it matters very much whether it is a little longer or a little shorter before the inevitable oblivion, steadily flooding the sands of time, effaces the scratches on the sand, which we call history. In a geologic sense, as the ages roll by in the life of this globe, what difference can it make? The few weeks' remembrance of the average, hard-working, clean-living citizen, and the few years, or few hundreds of years, or few thousands of years, before the memory of the mighty fades into the dim gray of time, and then vanishes into the blackness of eternity. Within the final chapter, afterward, the same chapter 48, we learn of the fate of Samuel Clemens' line. Of his 3 daughters, 2 had died childless and unmarried in the author's lifetime. The third, Clara Clemens Gabrilowicz, had a single child, born 4 months after her famous father's death. Nina grew up to be a confused, unhappy woman who herself died in her 50s, alone in a hotel room in Los Angeles, of a drug overdose, presumably a suicide. Thus, the Clemens line ended. Theodore Roosevelt's progeny had been much more numerous. He had 6 children, 5 of them by his second wife, Edith, a girl and 4 boys. One of the boys, the youngest, Quentin, died in combat. Affianced but unmarried in the First World War. But the other children, Ted, Kermit, Ethel, and Archie, each had 4 children, all but one of whom grew to maturity. No race suicide there. And to conclude, there was Alice, by the Colonel's first wife, who had died at the time of the infant's birth. Princess Alice, the press's darling, ever since that debut of hers at 18 in 1902. Alice had married 4 years later, while her father was still in the White House. The wedding, the single most glamorous, most dazzling social event of his entire administration. But her husband, the erstwhile eligible bachelor Nicholas Longworth of Ohio, proved to be an industrious womanizer, So that by 6 or 7 years into his marriage with Alice, the magic for both of them had fled. Let me end by reading the conclusion of Mark Twain and the Colonel. Although Mr. and Mrs. Longworth kept up appearances more or less thereafter, often they went their separate ways. On February 14th, 1925, just after her 41st birthday, Alice gave birth to her only child. Her husband took Paulina, little Polly, in and loved her and always treated her as his own, although Senator Bora of Idaho was the child's natural father. The convivial Nicholas, after distinguished service as Speaker of the House of Representatives, the Longworth Office Building in Washington is named in his honor, died at 61 in 1931. Having earlier attempted suicide, alas, the sadness inherent in endings, Paulina died of a drug overdose in 1957. She was 31. Her mother Alice, however, the celebrated Mrs. L, lived on. Witty, admired, envied, once so beautiful, and for long afterward, a social force. Her invitations coveted. She, the other Washington monument, in attendance at quadrennial presidential nominating conventions into old age, friend of chief executives as late as Richard Nixon, tart-tongued and ever quotable, dying at 96, not before 1980. How bright it all shone once, this image of Alice now fading, as finally Mark Twain's image will fade, one supposes, and Roosevelt's will fade. Even as Pharaoh Nectanebo's image had faded, even as the Holy Roman Emperor Conrad II, and nearer home the Bay Colony's imposing Puritan worthies have. At last, even Mark Twain's and the inextinguishable Roosevelt's renown will fade. But at present, a century after their deaths, and unlike so many of their contemporaries, the Josh Billingses, the Artemus Wards, the Petroleum V. Nasbys, the Chester A. Arthurs, the Benjamin Harrisons, the Warren G. Hardings, all those crowding figures fading into the dim gray of time before vanishing in Roosevelt's own stark image into the blackness of eternity. Unlike those, these two uniques, these mighties of our politics and our culture, the one who strove in the arena, the other who wryly observed, leave us rejoicing. And how lifelike both of them linger among us. How high they tower still. Thank you. I'd be happy to take questions if you have any. If you have any. It's a pleasure to see so many of you here.
Right. These farmers quit shares and they that's right, they forgot about it. That's like they have a rock slope out there.
Let's see. Any questions? Yes.
I'm curious, one of the other contemporaries of the two was William Jennings Bryan, who shared a lot of the views of Mark Twain. What did Twain, did you run across any thoughts of Twain about Bryan?
Twain's, at the time that Bryan was a political figure, was pretty well involved with H.H. Rogers, who was the executive at the very pinnacle of Standard Oil. And many of you, all of you, I'm sure, know how Rogers came to Mark Twain's assistance after his bankruptcy and restored him to prosperity and was his dearest friend in his old age. And Rogers advised Twain against the financial stand of Bryan as a candidate in 1896 and again in 1900, that the inflationary tendencies of going to silver versus gold would be very, very hard on the country and certainly very hard on the creditor class. And so Mark Twain would not support Bryan at all. Roosevelt found Bryan really a threat to the nation because he was stirring up the mobs, and Roosevelt was a man of the middle. He didn't like the extremes either on the lunatic fringe of the left, as he called it, or the extreme on the right, the robber barons on the right. So clearly, Bryan, in his appeals to the multitudes, his democratic ways of wanting to legislate prosperity for the masses, stirring up class warfare, as Roosevelt saw it, was not. There's no one Roosevelt could even respect. Any other questions? Didn't discourage questions by that answer, yeah.
How often did they actually?
Not very often. They were aware of each other very much because when of course the 23 years difference in their ages, when Roosevelt graduated from Harvard, A Tramp Abroad, Mark Twain's travel book, second travel book, came out, and Roosevelt thought it was the funniest book he had ever read, laughed himself purple reading it, his sister reported. And when Roosevelt went on his grand safari, year-long safari after he left the White House, he took along among his very select books that he carried. He couldn't bring a lot of books, but he brought Huckleberry Finn, which he had probably read 20 times up to then. He very much admired Mark Twain. He did not admire his anti-imperialism, and he remarked at one time that he would like to skin Mark Twain alive for that, and because Roosevelt was a trained taxidermist, that was something to take seriously. The reason that Mark Twain felt that, or I should say the reason Roosevelt felt that way was not only because of Mark Twain's treasonous remarks about anti-imperialism, but also his remarks about missionaries, which Mark Twain had not very much use for either. Missionaries should stay home and take care of America's problems and not interfere with foreign countries and try to get at little children when they were 6 years old before they had proper job. In fact, Mark Twain's feelings about missionaries, and Roosevelt differed from that. But the question that you asked is, how often did they meet? They met several times, probably 10, 15 times in their life, and they certainly were well aware. They were in the same room very often, and they certainly were well aware of each other and very respectful of each other in public. And Mark Twain, in 1906, when he was in Washington, was invited to the White House for a private dinner, and that was when he met Mrs. Roosevelt. He had dinner or luncheon with Roosevelt and his wife, and he came home singing Mrs. Roosevelt's praises. And at the time, they had a very cordial remark. People can do that. How cordial Obama was with Romney lately. What politicians know how to do, and what somebody like Mark Twain would know how to do. Any other questions?